Reading 97 from the Psychological Commentaries on the Teachings of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky by Dr. Maurice Nicoll, Volume 1. Berlip, December 7th, 1943. On Dreams. Part 2. In our last short discussion on dreams, it was said that dreams can come from every center, and that one of the most interesting things about dreams is that although your eyes are closed, you see things and people, even people you have never met, and you walk in buildings and feel embarrassed or confident. In other words, all that you experience in external life through your senses appears to take place when all your senses are cut off. When your external senses are not seeing the light of the sun or the light of searchlights or anything of that kind. Yet, you can enter now a world that is perfectly real to you. I suppose that this is the first thing to make us begin to wonder whether the external world registered by our senses is the only world we live in. People can have nightmares. People can be plagued by unhappy dreams, which appear quite real, if they have not learnt to non-identify. Our troubles do not lie only in the external world. Now, to revert to the dream that was spoken about in the last paper, I will quote it again. We were living at a kind of farm. Work people were around us. The peculiarity of this farm was that wherever you walked, you had to travel on duckboards, raised on stilts, above a swamp of all kinds of filth and muck, such as you find in a farmyard. If you slipped, you plunged into it, and anything you dropped was lost in it. When we sat at table and in conversation forgot what was beneath, we would suddenly awake to the fact that our feet were dangling in the filthy stuff. We had to remember all the time to hold them up above it. You remember that there are many dreams that have no meaning, but this dream has meaning. Whether a dream has meaning or not depends on which center it comes from. Influences reach us of every kind in the scale of things. If you have begun to understand the ray of creation, you will know that influences are reaching you all this time, and that these influences are of different qualities. These influences are registered by our psychic apparatus according to its level, or put in other words, we receive lower or higher influences according to our level of being. We are told in this work to try to listen to ourselves. Of course, if there is nothing to listen to, this would be absurd advice. But if you contemplate the ray of creation and all those influences coming down it, you may not think it absurd. We have to remember always that there are higher influences playing on us at this moment, but that if we are glued to our senses and completely identified with all that we are doing, we cannot become aware of these influences. Now, you may remember what is said in Ecclesiastes. Quote, "A dream cometh through the multitude of business." Something speaks to you. It is as if a person were trying to say something to someone who will talk very seriously to him about his affairs with which he is completely identified and which he takes as everything that has any meaning for him. He will be deaf to what is said. The multitude of business in which we live makes, as it were, a daily uproar. We cannot hear. Later on, perhaps we begin to listen when we decide that we must become simpler and can detach ourselves from our roles in life. Now, let us think of this dream that we are discussing from the standpoint that a dream cometh through the multitude of business. You will notice that the structure of the dream concerns mire, swampy ground, and that one has to learn to walk upon this and be very careful about it. I said very briefly that this meant life and how we walk upon it. One can always be completely engulfed by the situations that are continually produced by life, whether in business, in domestic, or in personal affairs, or in the wretched aspect of general life, such as it is at present. But the whole of the work is about non-identifying with all this mire, and expressed in the visible sensory language of parables. The meaning is that we have to learn to keep our feet out of this mire. Now, the mire is not outside oneself, but inside oneself. Take, for instance, the mire of negative emotions. Is it inside oneself or outside oneself? Take all one's forms of making inner accounts, feeling that one is owed, feeling bitter about it, and so on. We know a little about this by now. What does it mean to have duckboards and stilts, and to be careful not to stand on all this mud? It means that we have to be very careful how we walk in ourselves. It is psychological, that is about oneself inside. Now I will quote some interesting passages that I have found in the Old Testament that you can understand in connection with this dream that we are discussing. I must introduce the word pit. You will realize that the dream speaks about not going down into the pit, not falling into the mire. You can easily get into the stage in life, and most people remain in this stage, of making for yourself a pit of negativeness, hopelessness, self-pity, internal considering, and also of attributing everything to external circumstances, to outside people, and finally of being totally identified with outside things that have no value at all. Also, one can go down into the pit of making no effort about oneself. I will now quote from the sacred scriptures a few passages that refer to all this. Quote, God brought me out of the pit, out of the miry clay, and set my feet upon a rock. Note, God is esoteric teaching. Again, I went down to the bottom of the mountains. The bars of the earth were upon me, yet thou broughtest my life up from the pit. Note, the work can bring one up from the pit. And again, quote, O God, thou hast brought up my soul from hell. Thou hast kept me alive from those that go down into the pit and into the mire. Note, if you feel you have something to hold on to, then you can keep alive. And again, when the psalmist is in despair about himself, he says, I am accounted with them that go down into the pit. I am accounted as a man of no strength. Thou hast set me a pit in the lower regions, in the darkness and in the depths. Note, he feels he is falling asleep. One more example. Exult greatly. Behold, thy king cometh unto thee. He is just, wretched, and riding upon an ass. He will deliver thee out of the pit, wherein is no water. This last phrase has a very deep meaning, but you will realize that the pit wherein is no water means a state where there is no truth and no understanding. Let us turn to the Gospels. Christ said to the Pharisees, to the people who are quite sure that they are right and who attribute everything to themselves, quote, let them alone. They are blind leaders of the blind. If the blind lead the blind, both shall fall into the pit. It would be possible to quote, I suppose, 100 other examples from the sacred scriptures about the significance of this pit, this mire, this filth, which each one of us must see in himself and realize its significance for him or her. You will see from the dream we are discussing that it is this subject that is being dealt with. It is, so to speak, an esoteric dream. That is, a dream coming from higher centers. If one has a dream of this kind, one must not attribute it to oneself, to one's own cleverness. It is a formulation about the work, and as you have heard many times, this work is what higher centers would teach us if we could hear them. The work is not invented. It is not a psychological system invented by some ordinary man. It comes from higher man, from conscious influences, from those who are in touch with higher centers. Only because we cannot hear higher centers themselves owing to our state of deep sleep. Their continual inner teaching, to which we are deaf, has been turned into an external system of work, formulated by those who are already in touch with higher centers. In other words, we have to learn externally, from outside, from our senses, what we could already know if we could only listen to ourselves and render quiet the uproar of the daily wheels of personality. Now let us speak about what the duckboards might mean psychologically. Can you think what this image, exactly comparable with an image in a parable, might mean? Or can you think what stilts might mean psychologically? I would like you to discuss this, and also what it means that when you are talking, as the dream says, you are liable to get your feet in the mire. You must all have noticed that when you have been talking at random or saying all sorts of unhappy things about others, you lose force. But if you have not been doing this, you feel stronger in yourselves. Silence gives strength. One must learn to be silent even when speaking. It is this inner feeling of integrity that means strength. Of course, you can always say 1,000 things. You can always poison others with your negative emotions. You can always hand on unpleasant things. You can always hint at something that has been said. All this takes you down into the mire, which is exactly what a person must try to escape from sinking into. Everyone must see his own mire. Often it is what a person does not think is mire at all. He thinks, for instance, that he has a right to worry, to be continually talking about life things, or talking about his business, about his own affairs, his private difficulties. To talk consciously about one's affairs is quite different from talking mechanically. To talk consciously, I repeat, is quite different from talking mechanically. What does it mean to talk consciously about your troubles, for example? It means to formulate. And formulation means to be conscious of both sides, of what you are like, of what the other person is like, and so on. Just try to do this. You will notice that it means that all sorts of mechanical eyes in you are checked and deprived of their desire to speak. If you do this, you will understand what strength means. You remember how the psalmist complains that because he had no inner strength, he was sunken into the inner pit. Remember that your lives are your own, and that in a sense, no one else can help you. But the work can help you if you apply it. We reach a certain stage, perhaps of personal work, and then fall again into this mire. At first, we may not notice it, but after a time, we really become aware of our inner state. And then, if the work means anything to us, we begin to feel that we cannot bear to be in this mire. This means that the inner taste of the work has begun to act on us. Then we are no longer made unhappy simply by adverse external conditions, but we begin to be unhappy in quite a new way, namely with regard to our inner state, to where we are in ourselves. When this stage is reached, we may be sure that the work has begun to act on us directly, and then we will know that the only thing that can save us from this mud farm is to practice what this work is teaching us. Give way to a negative I. Give way to negative imagination, feeling that things are not fair, identifying, and thus consenting to every doubt, and so on. Then you are using neither duckboard nor stilts, nor any of the apparatus of this work. All this work is about lifting us off what we might call in these papers, which are merely commentaries. Mud farm. But remember that this mud farm is in yourselves. The work is to get to a new level of understanding. It is to get us to the next story in our personal evolution where there is no mud. I am taking this dream because it shows the first stage or level. It does not reach the next level. It represents what we have to do in regard to the level we are on, the level of being we are on, which is represented as mud. At the same time, it shows that on the side of knowledge there are certain things that we must practice. The use of duckboards and stilts and walking delicately on this mud in ourselves. In other words, it represents the first stage of this work, practically applied to ourselves. You will notice how beautifully higher emotional center formulates about the work. Its formulations of the work are as beautiful as those in the parables, in the Gospels.